Hey folks, welcome back to our last lesson in the circulation unit. We are going to check out a quick little bit about fetal circulation in this presentation. We've spent lots of time looking at the circulation and blood components and all kinds of cool stuff in the sort of adult body, I guess. But what I want to do is spend just a few minutes, this video shouldn't be quite as long, looking at some of the intricacies and changes for a developing fetus. So when you and I were in our mom's wombs, there were bits and pieces of the circulatory system that were a little bit different. Some of them didn't need to function like they do in an adult. So there are some cool little modifications which occur until we're born. So let's look at some of those. So looking at blood flow, you can probably appreciate that the fetus isn't breathing in the womb. The lungs are too dense. You probably know, maybe some of you don't, that the fetus sits in something called amniotic fluid. So it's actually bathed in this fluid that is actually hugely important in preventing things like infection. So a protective fluid, which means obviously you can't breathe if you're in fluid. If a woman close to sort of labor or close to the end of term has her water break, that's when the amniotic fluid, there's a break in that sac and the amniotic fluid leaks out. So that's in there to protect the developing fetus, but it means the fetus doesn't breathe. So what ends up happening is that fetus still needs to get rid of CO2 from cellular respiration, just like you and I do, and that fetus still needs oxygen to power cellular respiration, just like you and I do. So what we have here is the mum in the blood supply is actually going to provide the removal of CO2 and the addition of O2. I do want you to keep in mind, and this note does come up, that a small amount of blood does go to the lungs. We don't really need blood going to the lungs in the pulmonary loop like we have in the adult circulatory system because those lungs aren't functioning. But the lungs do need to, there we go. The lung tissue does need to grow and be ready to breathe, sort of at the moment that baby is born. So we do have to have a small amount of blood going to the lungs just to help provide nutrients and growth to the lung cells. So there you go. How is the baby sort of breathing? And don't think about it as breathing, but how does the baby get rid of CO2 and get O2? How does that gas exchange happen? Well, it happens through the umbilical cord, which is attached to mum. So really, it's mum that's doing the gas exchange, and we've got this cool little pipe, if you want to call it, the umbilical cord, going from mum to baby. So the umbilical cord consists of several different vessels. There is the umbilical vein. Remember, veins carry blood. Which direction? To the heart. So the umbilical vein, we're now talking about the blood vessel that's going to the fetal heart, to the fetus's heart. We're not talking about it in relation to the mum's heart. We're talking about it in relation to the fetus's heart. So the umbilical vein, here's another exception, it's actually carrying oxygenated blood, right? It is coming from mum full of oxygen. It would come off of her left ventricle, out of her aorta, down through some specialized blood vessels into the umbilical cord. And it's carrying oxygenated blood with lots of nutrients to the fetal heart. Now, we don't want this blood going through the liver. The liver is that sort of blood filtering system. And if the blood were to go through the fetal liver, it would reduce the blood pressure too much. Because remember, the liver is full of those really, really tiny capillaries. And when you go from a big pipe, like the umbilical vein, into small capillaries and then back into a big pipe, that reduces the pressure by a huge amount. And that's why veins are low pressure and we have to have valves in some of them. So what's kind of cool is there is a bypass where the fetus's liver isn't working. And that blood bypass is called the ductus venosus. So that's a term you'll want to know. Oh, sorry, I already answered that question. So the veins have low blood pressure. Going through the capillaries in the liver would lower the blood pressure just too much. The blood would be traveling too slowly if it went through the liver. So we let the mum's liver do the filtering of the blood, before that blood ends up in the umbilical vein going to the fetus. So mom is sort of filtering blood for 2. The baby's liver can just take a break and start functioning post-birth. There you go. No filtering of blood by that fetal liver. Number 2, the umbilical arteries. So these are now carrying blood away from the fetal heart. So remember, this is in relation to the fetus's heart. So those branch off the fetal iliac arteries, which is kind of weird because that's sort of lower down, but it doesn't really matter where. And they are carrying the deoxygenated blood and any waste products to the placenta. And that's where a bunch of that gas exchange is going to happen between mom's blood and the fetal blood. There's a picture for you of a baby who was removed with the placenta. So this is the placenta. This is where gas exchange and nutrient exchange and waste exchange happens between the baby and the mom. So their blood actually doesn't mix. Their blood vessels just run really close together. And then by diffusion, things like CO2 and O2 will move across concentration gradients, as will nutrients. So there actually isn't mixing of the blood between the baby and the mom while the baby is in utero, in the uterus, which is kind of cool. And that's why babies can have a different blood type than their mom. And life is still good because their blood types aren't mixing. And you could have an agglutination reaction where if they were alternate blood types, the mom's blood may attack the baby's blood. That would happen if the blood mixed. But they're actually 2 totally separate systems, just pipes running close. And then you can see this umbilical cord. Pretty gnarly. That thing is like really, really thick. Looks like something out of a sci-fi movie, right? Where you're being kept alive like the Matrix or something, with some big pipe providing life-giving fluid in your belly button. So kind of a crazy picture to see what's going on for all of us, or what was going on for all of us as fetuses. Another cool little bypass here, we want to keep blood away from those lungs, like we mentioned right off the top, is something called the foramen ovale. Some people call it the foramen ovale. You'll hear slightly different pronunciations, doesn't really matter. We actually talked about this when we looked at holes in the heart. You may remember we talked about atrial septal defects, which were the heart, or sort of holes in the heart between the right and left atrium, up at the top. And in some people, those didn't fill in like they should. So this is in the fetal heart. It's a little valve that allows blood to go from the right atrium into that left atrium. And that's cool because it's going to prevent blood from going into the right ventricle and then going off to the lungs. Because that's kind of pointless. We don't want all the blood going to the lungs if the lungs aren't functioning. So here the blood comes into the right atrium. It does not go down this way. Not most of it anyways. Probably 50% of it anyway will go from the right atrium into the left atrium. And hopefully you remember that the left side is the, hey, let's pump blood to the body side, which is good. Then the blood goes from left atrium into the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle out to the baby's body. Now, that's not perfect. There you go. Reroutes oxygenated blood from the right atrium over to the left atrium, and then off it goes. It doesn't stop all of the blood from going to the lungs, though. Some of it will still sneak through the tricuspid valve here into that right ventricle. So foramen ovale, or foramen ovale, however you want to say it, foramen ovale, take your pick, hole between, or valve between the atria in the fetal heart. Seals over as soon as the baby takes their first breath, or starts to seal over in most people. So here's a question for you. Some blood does pass through the foramen ovale and go over to the left-hand side, which is good. It bypasses the lungs. But some blood still goes into the right ventricle. Where would that blood go? Right ventricle, big squeeze up to the lungs. And again, we don't want lots of blood going to the lungs. So let's say still 50% of the blood might go down into that right ventricle. How do we stop 50% of the blood going to the lungs? Because we don't need that much going to the lungs. We do need a small amount to So how does the fetal heart stop still lots of blood, 50% of blood, from going to those non-functional lungs? Well, there's another bypass in there that's kind of cool. This one is called the ductus arteriosus. And in this picture, it's right here. So this is looking at blood that does go into the right ventricle. Right ventricle squeezes. That should be carrying blood off side to side to the lungs. But there is actually another little valve that allows that, remember this blood is oxygenated. It allows that oxygenated blood, a little hole, right between the pulmonary artery and the aorta, which is kind of cool. So this is blood going to the body, like it says here. This should be blood going to the lungs, but we don't really want it to go to the lungs. So why don't we allow another little bypass so that these two arrows can just join together, and then the vast majority of the blood simply goes to the body without going to the lungs. So it's a pretty cool little system. I really like these two bypasses, and they're going to work, I bet, to get more than 90% of the blood away from the lungs. And then you will have a little bit going towards those developing lungs so they can develop properly. So there it connects the pulmonary artery to the aorta, like we mentioned already. So it's just another lung bypass. Pretty slick little system. And that opening, as soon as the baby is born and takes its first breath, there is a trigger, or that is a trigger, for some chemical reactions to happen that will also help close up that opening. So both the ductus arteriosus and the foramen ovale both start to close as soon as the baby is born. And there you go. Small amount of blood still going to the lungs because the lungs do need to develop. Baby's first breath, the lungs expand, right? They're not covered in this amniotic fluid. They sort of inflate for the first time, like blowing up a balloon for the first time. Reduces their density. Those lungs immediately, boom, start gas exchange at the alveoli. It's pretty cool. They've been developing. They're ready to do that. And changing the density of their lungs, like I mentioned earlier, causes probably a whole cascade or a whole chain of events that cause the foramen ovale and that ductus arteriosus to start closing. So pretty amazing. You hear that baby cry for the first time. If or when you guys have your own kids, nothing like it to have your own child in your arms the very first time. The connection that you will feel between yourself and them is undescribable. You can't be ready for it. It's really, really cool. But the first time they start screaming, and if they're like my kids, they screamed and screamed and screamed for months and months and months, and that part wasn't so fun. My kids are close, I have to say that quietly. No, it's all good. But the first time you hear that cry, that is the start, and the nerdy biologist brain that I have sort of went, oh, look at that. The holes in their heart are going to start closing. But pretty darn cool. There you go. End of that slideshow. So that is the conclusion of the circulation unit. Hopefully you found that one really interesting. I think it's super cool. Give the circulation assignment a try. Make sure you finish that off. There is on the website a circulation review assignment for you to try. And there will be on Teams 5 different quizzes for you to do. Sort of a quiz for every one of the lessons. The last quiz may include sort of a focus on this one, the fetal circulation, but it will also include some more application style questions where you have to think a little bit, stuff where you can't just go Google search it. If you have any questions about anything in the 5 lessons from this unit, fire me an email, hit me up in a Zoom meeting. I'd love to chat with you. Otherwise, good luck on those quizzes, and I will chat with you soon.